brother. What's up?
Hey man, I'm so sorry.
Hey, no. That's no worry. It's my fault. I should have told you I'm on the East Coast, and I should have looked in
I
your
knew
time zone.
that, and I
Yeah,
just I just didn't think about it. I saw nines. Okay, nine.
yeah. Nine
As
means nine.
it's nine all over the world at the same
Yeah, yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. Welcome, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to do this.
Yeah, me too. And it looks like you've got the a wonderful virtual background behind you. Wow,
It's real.
it's real. Wow, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
A little piece of paradise.
So,
That's
so where?
Lake LBJ, named
Oh,
after
okay.
the president who was a Mason.
In Texas.
Yeah.
Wow.
He
Wow.
he, he was initiated, uh, and he never went further than that. And the best I've been able to dig up is that he looked around and all he saw were white people in the room, and that bothered him. So he
Wow.
left. Uh,
Wow. That bothered him when?
oh gosh, that would have been I think the 40s.
Right. Wow. So he was a kind of a progressive in that sense back then.
Yeah, he was a complicated guy, but uh, he was definitely socially progressive. Uh, but he did come from the deep south and was able to very convincingly tap into a certain kind of rhetoric to get people who weren't as socially progressive to go along with some kind of progressive measure he was trying to get passed.
Rhetoric. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll get to that. so, so brother Robert William Marshall, do you like to be called by your full name like that, Robert William Marshall, or do most people just say Robert Marshall, or really that,
Whatever's fine.
whatever? Okay. Yeah, I was just going by your Facebook version of your
Yeah.
name. Yeah.
I think that's from way back when Facebook first started.
Oh wow.
The, the way it was signed up, the way you signed up, it I think it used to force you to use your full name, and then you could
Hmm.
edit it to change it later.
Right. And then there was a
I
period
just
of
never
time.
changed it.
There was a period of time where you couldn't use a false name on Facebook.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
they've let go of that
Oh,
restriction
did
now.
they really?
I think so because I see so many people with like weird names that seem made up. So yeah, I guess it's okay now. Who
It
knows?
must be because there's a fake persona out there called Dearest Martha Marshall that somebody made up to be my. She's like my fake wife, and they write war letters to me.
Oh my God! Wow.
And she's on Facebook, so I know
Never a
she
dull
doesn't.
moment. Never a dull moment,
Yeah.
huh? So yeah, brother. So well, thank you very much for coming on the show. Usually I like to start off by just getting to know the person I'm talking to, and like I'd just love to hear about your background, both before masonry and then how that led into masonry and how you got interested and eventually joined masonry. But I'd love to hear just your background too, like where you grew up. It's kind of biographical, and what you studied in college and such, and then how that sort of led into masonry.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in just outside of Waco, Texas, the home of the Colts.
Yeah.
And,
I always
um,
think of that when I see that you're from Waco. I'm like, oh, man, is this guy all right? Is he a little cuckoo?
so uh, my mom's family moved to Waco in the 1800s. I had an ancestor who was a toll keeper on the Waco Suspension Bridge. It was at that time, very medieval looking brick bridge that was the longest single span suspension bridge west of the Mississippi, and maybe in America at the time of its construction in 1870. He was a member of Waco Masonic Lodge, as were the guys who were in charge of building it. And um, my mom's family's been in Waco ever since. My dad's family was from Kansas, especially the Lawrence area where they had moved to from Germany in the early 1800s to start a vineyard. Growing up in Waco, I was very close to my great grandparents. Uh, my great grandfather was a Mason, and my great grandmother was Eastern Star, and a very just socially and organizationally involved lady. Uh, Things related to masonry and things not.
But
I
not your
don't. I had
parents.
no,
Your
no.
parents, no.
Mm-mm. I've got Masons in my family going back several generations, but my parents' generation, as far as I know, there are not any Masons except for one distant cousin on my mom's side. Um, and My dad has had a petition on his desk for about 8 years, filled out, signed. He got it, recommenders and everything, and he just has not turned it in yet. I don't.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think he has a lot of anxiety about the memory work, and maybe
Ah,
some social anxiety too. But
interesting.
yeah. I do have four brothers. None of them are Masons. Uh, let's see, one, maybe two of them I would recommend. Uh,
I see
uh,
how it goes. Yeah, I know, brothers. I know.
uh, yeah, but that great grandfather that I was close to growing up, he grew up in a circus in North Carolina. The circus was owned by his father, who was a past master of his lodge in Wilmington, and he grew up in the circus there. And then in 1938, joined the U.S. Army as a teenager. He was in Pearl Harbor, stationed with the Army at the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor,
Oh, wow.
and then spent most of World War II in the Pacific Theater. Uh, Lived in Germany immediately after the war. That's where my grandmother graduated high school, and he was already a Mason. I don't have any reason to believe that he was especially active during that time. Uh, I'm still hoping to find some kind of example of him being active with either a military Masonic lodge or a military Masonic club. Those were pretty popular in that time. He continued serving in the Army through Korea, actually made it in some history books there, and
Oh, wow.
was an advisor during Vietnam. And so by the time I came along in the 90s, he was a very old man, and probably physically even older than he actually was, just from 30, 40 years being an Army officer. But he did instill some ideas in me. There were pomegranates planted in the front tree, or sorry, in the front yard, and uh, I remember getting mad one time when I was a kid because a neighbor kid had come over and stolen some of our pomegranates and was eating them, and I got mad. Those are our pomegranates. You can't have them. And I got in trouble for not wanting to share. And he gave me this whole spiel about
Oh,
how when God blesses you with plenty, it's your job to share the plenty with your
wow.
neighbors,
That's great.
which would have never meant anything to me until years later, going through the
Yeah.
degrees and hearing lectures, and like, huh. Uh,
Yes. And for
uh,
those listeners that don't know the connection there, pomegranates are typically symbolic of plenty and abundance because of all the seeds they have.
that's right. Yeah. And so then, as a young man, he had passed away when I was a kid, but my great grandmother passed away when I was a young man. I inherited their furniture, and in his dresser was a hidden rotating drawer, and when it rolled out, there was his Masonic coins and pins and his Scottish Rite certificate, and also some military stuff. And what's this all about? I was aware of Freemasonry. I was aware that he was a Mason. He had recommended my brother into the Scottish Rite Hospital when we were kids for some issues he had with his hips. So it was a relevant thing to me, but it wasn't until rotating that drawer and being my age, national treasure and all that was had come out a few years earlier, and I enjoyed it and was interested in it. So it was like I might be Robert Langdon. I don't know.
Yes, it's good to get some inspiration, however you can, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Uh, and so I did what any millennial does. I Googled Freemasonry and Waco Masonic Lodge popped up, and I went and joined it.
There you go.
Uh,
Now you have a skull on your shirt. See how that goes?
yeah, that's right. That's the logo for the Historical Light podcast.
Yes.
But at the time that I became a Mason, I was already in college at Baylor University. So Baylor is the largest Baptist university in the world. I grew up, what I usually tell people was nominally Baptist. So my family claimed to be Baptist, but it was mostly I might get dropped off at the church on Mother's Day type of thing. And even that might not happen. But that's very common. My parents considered themselves religious despite having very little religious activity in their lives. And so I remember as a kid when Harry Potter came out, I was always a reader, avid reader, for as far back as I can remember. And I brought one of the Harry Potter books home. I don't remember if it was the first or second one. And my dad just lost it. You can't bring a magic book in this house. Magic's evil, and it's got the devil, and all that. So I had to smuggle Harry Potter into my house from then on to read it. And to his credit, as a man, over the past 20 years now, he's really come around on a lot of that kind of stuff, to understanding that. For example, Harry Potter has lots of Christian symbolism and meaning kind of weaved through it.
So sorry to interrupt you there, but that's an interesting little point you made about magic and your dad, thinking anything that looks like magic is evil. Only because that's been coming up with me. I've been looking into some non-Masonic magical orders recently, and my wife started getting nervous. And I think it's just when they see symbols, like whenever you're drawing something on the floor with chalk with circles and you're saying a prayer or something, immediately people think of like The Exorcist or these movies they've seen. You know what I mean?
Satanic, baby.
Yeah, satanic stuff. And I tried to have a rational discussion with her about it. I'm like, yeah, but I mean, these are prayers from the Bible. It's all for good stuff. It's for healing and for spiritual growth, and it's not like there's no prayer saying, hey, I want to bring evil into the world, please, oh Lucifer, bring the darkness. If I was doing that, then I think you should be worried. But if I'm just praying for like healing and goodness in the world and open my heart, I mean, how is that evil? It's just because there's geometry involved or candles. It's like a perception thing. It's an optics more than anything rational.
I think a big part of it is the product of the satanic panic craze of the 60s and 70s that we're still, as a society, navigating the consequences of.
Which was a real bad time. I mean, there were some really awful things happening, and they were mixing magical ritual with some really negative stuff. And it's sad that that has colored anything magical, in some sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, I often wonder, and I've even done some deep dive research trying to connect some dots, but I think it's interesting, at least, that the height of the satanic panic craze across the country also happened to have been the height of Masonic membership in terms of quantity in America, and we've been on a downhill slide ever since.
Interesting.
You take a lot of the esoteric thing, Manly Hall or Arthur Wade, or a lot of these guys in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and a little later, carried a lot of weight and influence in the fraternity. But in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of that stuff started being suppressed within Freemasonry. You mentioned magic, but also just more general things.
Anything deeper or mystical or whatever was kind of suppressed. In an effort to make, I guess, Masonry more palatable to the general public, a little more mundane, more practical focus on charity and just having a drink with a fraternity, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's interesting. I think we're living in a really great time right now, seeing that pendulum kind of swing back in the other direction.
absolutely.
Not to an extreme. I think that so far what I've seen, there's a nice balance of it.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
a lot of those kinds of deeper, esoteric, mystical things uh, are very appealing to new Masons right now,
Yes.
and it's cool to see.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. So, so that's interesting. A little bit of your background there. So, what was it that drew you to join Masonry? I mean, I know some of your grandparents were involved and such, but what was it at the end of the day that made you think, you know what, I want to join this?
So history was a big part of it. Now, I mentioned that at the time that I joined, I was at the biggest Baptist university in the world. Well, Baylor was and is continuing to undergo this interesting thing where uh, ideologically they have the identity of being a major evangelical Christian university, but as a university, they're also not in full agreement with some of the directions that the evangelical Christian tradition has been going. Uh, so on campus, there's almost an identity crisis, and you're having lots of Baptist students show up as freshmen as Baptists, and then they leave as seniors as Catholic, Episcopalian, Buddhist, uh, Wiccan, you name it. So much so, and it's so prevalent that it's actually kind of considered something of a crisis on campus, and the board of trustees has put out messages about it, and
Wow.
not in a negative way. They're not saying, oh no, we're turning Baptists into Catholics. What will we do? But that kind of conversation is happening. So in the midst of that, I started looking at Judge Robert Baylor and some of the other more famous presidents of Baylor, like Rufus Burleson, and was finding that they had all been not only Freemasons in the 1800s, but very active Freemasons, past masters and officers of their lodges and grand officers and things like
Mm,
that.
mm,
Uh, and so at the same time, the leading Baptist community in the area was very anti-Masonic. And I thought it was strange that here I am at a university based on these people's tradition. They're telling me Freemasonry is evil, but all of these people that they have statues of all over campus were active Masons. So
right.
uh, between that and my family background, I started looking into it from a historical perspective. My major at that time was Great Texts of the Western Tradition. It's a very weird little program at Baylor. At that time in their honors college, I think they've opened it up to general students now, which I think is really good. It'll bring a more diverse perspective into the classroom. But at that time, you had to be an honor student, and then you had to be doubly weird enough to pick that as a major.
Mhm.
And so, for example, I think my year there were four of us at a university with 16,000 students,
Oh, wow.
and it's a blend of philosophy, literature, theology. I picked up a second major, history, and so while getting degrees in history and great texts, I started looking into Freemasonry for the historic perspective and tying it into some of the books and literature that I was picking up in my great texts courses. Uh,
Fascinating.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
that's what started your interest. That's great. So, speaking of the historical perspective on Masonry, I think you did a presentation on Native Americans and Freemasonry, or you have a presentation on that.
Hmm.
I'm from upstate New York, Onondaga County in Syracuse originally. And I know that, there's a pretty strong Native American tradition there. And there's some possible connection with the development of our own, I think, constitution and our own democratic form of government,
Hmm.
potentially with the Native Americans and some of their principles and their ideologies. I think that's a fascinating area to look into. And also, I mean, how much did we actually learn from the Native Americans in establishing the foundations of our democracy? I think that's a fascinating research topic. I know Pike was very close with the Native Americans. He was like an ambassador for them, and he got to know them. He seems like he was the kind of guy that really developed trust with these people, and they
Mhm.
respected him as one of those white men that kind of got it and understood us. Um, yeah, so I mean, what are some of the linkages you see with the Native Americans and Freemasonry?
Well, regarding the founding fathers, Joseph Brant, probably the most famous Native American of the 18th century, was a Freemason, and
Oh wow,
he was involved in some of the Native American organizations that I believe are usually referred to as being a basis for some of those founding documents and structure, like the Iroquois
wow,
Confederacy and all that type of stuff.
yes, yes,
Uh, and Joseph Brant was a very interesting man. There was a point at which during the war, an enemy soldier was going to be burned at the cross. That's how his people were dealing with uh, enemies that were to be executed. And I mean, the guy is really, I said cross, I should have said stake. That's an
right,
important difference.
right.
Uh, but this soldier is tied to the stake, and I mean, they're about to set him ablaze when the soldier says a very particular phrase, the Masonic
Right.
sign of distress and its accompanying words. And it's I'll
Wow.
say as a historian, it's kind of funny because there are lots of examples of stories like this in history. And I've found that 70% of the stories are fake, but this is one that I've been able to find confirmation through three primary sources of people who were there. So it happened,
Wow.
and he spared the man's life.
Oh,
Uh,
that's really what I wanted to know. Did it actually work?
it
Did it
did,
get him out of the trouble?
yeah, it did.
That's
Uh,
great.
so there's an early example of a Native American who was a Freemason. Now, personally, you know, you can dig into a lot of those. There were other relatively famous Native American Freemasons, but personally, I find it more interesting looking into uh, similarities in their culture and Masonic culture, so to speak.
Mm, mm.
Uh, and so, uh, secret societies or uh, almost monastic like brotherhoods
Mm.
were a thing in some First Nations tribes. And those are the ones I really like to look at to compare and contrast their esoteric or ceremonial traditions with what we have in Freemasonry. The Karankawa people in South Texas are one such people who had some kind of secret order where the members wore a triangular uh, helmet or some kind of triangular hat with a circular disc in the middle of it. And unfortunately, the Karankawa people are all gone now, but some of their enemies, uh, some of the other natives with whom they often battled, recorded in their histories the understanding that the triangular circular disc brotherhood of the Karankawa people had something to do with immortality of the soul and the sun.
Wow.
Uh,
Wow. That's a
uh,
pretty big link
pretty,
right there.
yeah, well, interesting
Yeah.
for sure. Uh, you also have the legend of Red Hand. I don't want to butcher the story, but it's worth looking up.
Mm.
I'll say it's extremely similar to the third degree legend in Freemasonry,
Oh.
and some Masonic historians in the past used it to try to argue that Freemasonry existed in America before Europeans brought it here, and that was actually a very common idea that was popular in Freemasonry at one point.
Hmm.
That somehow Freemasonry came to America before the white men did, so to speak, which in my opinion, as a historian, I think it's a pretty absurd idea. If you're talking strictly in the sense of Freemasonry, the organization as we know it, if you
All
open the
right.
definition up to an esoteric tradition of brotherhood with a certain number of key principles,
Yes.
then maybe there's room to at least suggest that a kind of Freemasonry developed among Native people that was not inherited from ours, but completely separate and unique, while having
Right.
similarities.
Right. I mean, it kind of reminds me of, I'm trying to think of the researcher's name. He's Graham Hancock. And he's talked about, some ancient, older culture that was prevalent throughout the world, maybe, or an older culture that we all emerged from, and that spread after, I think, the flood, throughout the world. And so that's why you see so many spiritual and mystical similarities in some of these ancient cultures. The classic example is pyramids that you see in Mexico and Egypt.
Yeah.
But the symbolism that they use in common and some of the concepts. So yeah, I think that, and in some sense, truth is one, right? In some sense, you come to the truth, and it's a never changing thing. And so many cultures all over the world might get in touch with that truth, and when they do, it'll emerge in very similar ways. Maybe the colors will be different, or the shapes, or the way they talk about it slightly different, but the fundamentals will somehow be there again. um, and yeah, I see that with the Native Americans too, and especially they have the initiation ceremonies that they go through. You could almost say different degrees in their
Yep.
secret. They don't talk about them. And it's hard as a white guy to get into that. I've talked to some Native Americans in upstate New York at this one museum there. They also really focus on virtue and morality and ethics as Native Americans, and wisdom. And which is so akin to what's critical to a Freemason.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I have a lot
Well,
of
and
respect for Native Americans in general, especially the elders. I mean, those guys, they just, whenever they talk, it's just so laden with heavy wisdom and so much truth.
yeah, absolutely. So you've got they usually say four key principles, and I feel like I'm missing one right now off the top of my head, but I can
It's all right.
rattle three off that are found in most Native American cultures: love of deity, love of nature, and love of your fellow man.
Wow.
Uh, and that's as key as it gets when it comes to Freemasonry. But I think of those three, what's most interesting is the love of nature, because uh, due to whatever reason, industrialization, or I guess pick your reason, that's something that our culture has really gotten away from in a lot of ways. That Freemasonry points the modern man to in a very serious way, over and over and over again. Freemasonry encourages the modern man to uh, develop an appreciation and love for nature, which
That's
is
right.
probably the most in line with Native American culture piece of the Masonic
Right.
philosophy.
Yeah. The whole idea of studying the book of nature, and, if you get, God might be seen as saying, if you want to know me, study my fingerprint, which is throughout nature. Did you lose me?
No, there's.
Okay.
I'm sitting out at the lake, and the guy was starting up his boat, so I was making sure I was ready to mute it if I needed to.
Oh, okay. No worries. So far, there's no negative background noise. It's all positive. I'm hearing birds and stuff. It's awesome.
Okay.
So what are
Yeah,
you out? Are you out there just for like a weekend, little relaxing vacation, or?
yeah. This is a weekend home, and I haven't got to get out here much lately because of the pandemic. But
Yeah.
it's Lake LBJ, named after Lyndon Johnson, who
Beautiful.
was a Freemason.
So you're studying the book of nature out there.
Yeah, try to at least.
So you got a special effect on there. It looks like you're going into an eclipse or something.
Yeah, I'm not sure what just happened, but I don't know
That's
why it's doing
interesting.
that.
I mean, it's kind of cool, but
Let's see if I can fix that.
yeah, go ahead. Yeah, maybe it's some kind of setting. You got a little webcam, I'm assuming, or are you using a laptop?
Yeah, it is a webcam. Maybe there's something on there that I pressed. Huh. I don't know what it would have been.
Yeah, it looks like it's black and white or something.
Yeah, but I don't know how.
Yeah.
Oh well. Guess
Oh
I'll be
well.
in black and white.
Yeah. There you go. You got to be flexible during COVID-19.
That's right.
You got to adapt. We're all learning to
Weird.
adapt. That is weird.
Oh well. Guess I should mess with the camera. Learned my lesson.
There you go. That looks good now. It's a cool effect actually, black and white. Yeah. Maybe if you get more light on your face though.
Okay.
If that'll yeah. Otherwise, you're like completely darked out, shadowed. Yeah, that's kind of interesting.
I don't know what I did to it.
Yeah. So maybe we're gonna get deeper now. So let's see. I have some other things I want to talk to you about. Let's get a little deeper. How about the origins of Masonry in ancient Egypt? What are your thoughts on
Ooh.
that? I know that, I mean, that's something that really fascinates me. And I visited Cairo for the first time
Oh
probably about
wow.
8 months ago for my job. And, of course, I visited the pyramids and stuff, and I visited the Egyptian Museum. And one of the things I thought about was how a lot of these postures of these ancient Egyptian statues, whether it's pharaohs or and members of a royal class or something, or members of a society, of an initiatic society back then, they always seem to be doing what we would call as Mason signs. They'll do certain hand postures or whatever. I'm not saying I'm seeing like, oh my God, those are the Masonic signs. No,
Yeah.
they're different ones. But as a Mason, you go through different appendant bodies, different orders. You get new signs in each one, and there's so many different signs you can't even remember them sometimes.
Yeah, you can lose track pretty easy.
So signs are easy to come up with. I mean, a new order, new signs. But they look like signs. They look like they're showing, whatever they're doing with their hands or whatever the motion might be, that they're trying to show that they're a member of something. And that was my thought. And so did Freemasonry in its current form start in ancient Egypt? I doubt in its current form. But did the sort of these principles exist in secret societies of ancient Egypt? And was a lot of this, some of the deeper secrets of Masonry and sort of the mysteries, the true mysteries, which are, knowledge of the creator and our relationship to God. Did they have that understanding back then in ancient Egypt? And in a sense, could that have been passed down from then into Freemasonry that we practice today through our symbols, for example?
Yeah. So that's really cool. You just were in Cairo. That's awesome.
That was awesome.
Yeah, I've seen some of those signs, including some the claims that the signs resemble Masonic signs and stuff like that before, which, as you said, you're not doing here. But I've seen those claims before, and I think I'm very much in line with what you're saying, that there may be some kind of shared tradition there that has been interpreted over and over and over again and translated, and you know what happens when you interpret and translate things.
Oh yeah.
But I think guys are sometimes unnecessarily trying to show, well, this came from there and this came from there, instead of just looking at the broader traditions and things they have in common. Like, as you pointed out here, just the fact that there are signs at all that's interesting.
Yeah.
But in my presentation about the influence of ancient Egypt on Freemasonry, I tend to focus a lot on the 18th century Egyptian rite of Cagliostro, and kind of what led into that, and what came after that. But I did get
Can sorry, I didn't interrupt you there, but that's interesting. Could you explain for some folks who might be listening just briefly what that is, this Egyptian rite of Cagliostro?
Yeah, so Cagliostro is a controversial figure in the 1700s and in the 21st century, looking back at the 1700s. Some say he was a straight up con man, and some say he was an actual mystic. The historic record is equally unclear. He did start something like charity hospitals across Europe. He he was initiated into a Masonic order in London, and perhaps some other Masonic order at an earlier period while he was visiting Egypt or somewhere else. He was an orphan, or a bastard's child, and his father paid someone else to raise him. And uh, so what's clear about him is that nothing was clear about him, and including perhaps to himself. He may not have really known exactly who his father was or exactly where he came from.
Wow.
But it was someone wealthy who paid to have him taken very well care of and educated growing up. He developed the Egyptian rite. It was uh, depending on who you talk to, either Masonic or pseudo-Masonic or paramasonic order of degrees that I personally believe heavily influenced the Scottish Rite.
Fascinating.
It included the admission of women into the rite, which was then controversial and remains controversial now, and probably visible the most visible interaction we have with Cagliostro today is in Mozart's Magic Flute, where Sorastro is a character partially believed to be partially based on Cagliostro, because Mozart and Cagliostro did mingle into some similar circles at that time, and that they were contemporaries. And it's thought that Mozart probably was not very fond of the idea of women being initiated. And part of the Magic Flute addresses the idea of women being Masons. So the Egyptian rite is primarily based on the idea that Cagliostro taught regarding the origins of Freemasonry. And I suspect he actually believed. Some say that he didn't believe, but was just trying to push the idea for his personal gain or whatever. But either way, whether he believed it or not, he taught across Europe to very influential people that Freemasonry carried within it an ancient tradition linked to Egypt, and that he had learned during his travels how to tap into that ancient tradition, and was prepared to reintroduce it in its purer form to Freemasons.
Well, that sounds so sexy. If it's true, right? If it's true, that's exciting.
Yeah.
So I could see how that could interest anybody,
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, it got very popular, and he got pretty influential. He was in France quite a while until he got kicked out of there. And eventually he got stuck in a hole by the Vatican, and he lived out his life in the hole. So they didn't outright execute him. They just condemned him and left him down there until he died.
Oh boy. Yeah. It's tough when you're a free thinker, especially in some of these previous ages.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank God. Thank God today we could talk about all this weird stuff and have no fear.
Absolutely. But he referred to emerald tablet type stuff and hermetics, and was tracing ancient Egypt through a lot of those traditions, and showing how it was in Freemasonry. I think whether he was a con man or not, I think he was actually landing on some true piece of tradition that found its way into Freemasonry, either intentionally or unintentionally, in the early Masonic era.
Wow. So are the Egyptian rites written down, like these, the rituals, written down somewhere that's open to the public so you could actually see what these rituals contain and what's said?
Yeah, actually, so usually I do these podcasts and things in my library. I'm not there right now, or I'd pull it down. Bob Cooper has a book called, um oh, I think it's The Masonic Magician, Cagliostro and the Egyptian Rite, or something like that.
Okay.
It's got an Ouroboros on the front of it. Uh, that one actually has a full explanation of all of this stuff, including some of the ceremonies, which are really rather interesting uh, and intense. I'll say that if you
Wow.
read them and imagine doing them today, they are very
Oh.
intense.
Oh, you mean
But
intense, like traumatic a little bit, like
oh
scaring
yeah,
people or hurting people or anything? Tell me about some of the intense stuff.
I so off the top of my head, I seem to recall pistols being involved, but also lots of what I like to call techno shamanism.
Huh.
Which is actually something I try to bring into the lodge. Now, let's make a clear distinction. Pistols over here and the techno shamanism over here. It's the techno shamanism I try
Okay,
to bring
right.
into the.
I mean, because pistols sounds funny too. I mean, if it's an ancient Egyptian rite, did they have pistols back then? You
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
that's kind of an innovation, I think.
right. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But uh, smoke and incense and
Sure.
manipulation of light and uh,
Mood
things like
stuff.
that. But which personally for me, being a Texan, smoke, manipulation of light, incense, uh,
Pork.
strange language,
If you
those
mention
things are.
sport, if you mention pork, smoke in Texas, you got to mention pork, right?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Well, those things are far more intense to me than a pistol, right?
Right.
Because we're given pistols when we're in our diapers here. Big deal. There's a pistol, but
Ah, I
tell
see.
me
I
about the
see.
smoke and incense
Ah,
stuff.
yeah, 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 yeah. That's what's different for a Texan.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I got it.
But uh, you know,
So, yeah. So, but
regarding Egypt itself, getting jumping off the Cagliostro
sure.
thing, we're going to catch hell for talking about him. You'll see, but
Oh,
uh,
really? Oh,
yeah,
that's too
yeah.
bad. It's
But
just talk. We're, freedom of speech, you know.
uh, with ancient Egypt, something that I think is very interesting happening right now in archaeology is very serious on the academia side. Very serious explorations of the idea that some of the Old Testament Jewish figures were Egyptian leaders,
Mm,
like Amenhotep III, possibly being the real life
Moses.
King Solomon.
Or
Uh,
no, oh, King Solomon, right.
mhm.
Okay.
And there's a lot of work in academia being done along those lines right now. But it gets very interesting for Freemasonry because Amenhotep in the Egyptian historical volume is a figure remembered for things like uh, proliferating an idea of monotheism in ancient Egypt, which was uh, reality altering to those
Yes.
people at that time.
Like
And
like Akhenaten, right?
yes, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And um, I, I find those things interesting within the Masonic context because obviously the Old Testament Jewish leaders are very prominent in Freemasonry. I would even say openly so, right? I think
Yeah. Yeah.
that's an exoteric part of Freemasonry. That is not
Yeah.
hidden at all whatsoever. But then as you continue in Masonry, whether it's the Scottish Rite or just studying the three craft degrees, you start to land upon some of this stuff that seems to have a lot in common with ancient Egypt or other ancient traditions. And uh, if academia is now starting to explore what it would mean for some of the ancient Egyptian stories and the ancient Jewish stories to be about the same people, uh, I don't know why, as Freemasons, we shouldn't do the same thing with some of our ancient uh, characters in our ceremonies or just literature.
Yeah, I mean, and one thought just came into my mind about the idea of the Egyptians and the Jewish or the Hebrews being similar or the same people. Is I think of America. It's like I'm an American, you're an American, but we might have different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So in that sense, just, pragmatically, it doesn't mean that, the Egyptians were some pure mono race of people necessarily. There could have been a mix of people that were called Egyptians or ancient Egyptians, including the Jews.
Hmm.
That doesn't seem like an unreasonable thing to consider. And I think it comes back to your point, how people like to say, aha, look, this came from there. Like we want to see things very linearly, because it's easier for our brain to connect dots that way. But life in reality and history is, you know are composed of extremely complicated contexts that are interrelated, and complex systems at the end of the day. And nothing is so simple, historically, um, other than the stories we tell after the fact, where
Hmm.
we try to put together dots and stuff. But in reality, I think things were very complex, like the world today.
Yep, absolutely, I
I mean, that's
agree.
just my personal opinion.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep.
Yeah. So, brother, I think you did the George Washington was a Mason presentation also,
Mhm.
which can take different routes, and I think that's, I'm in Virginia. I'm a Virginia Mason, um, in Ashburn, and um, so a lot of Masons in Virginia are real proud of the fact that Washington was from here and
Mhm.
was a Mason in Virginia. Um, and so, in your research on Washington, what really struck you, and as something you didn't realize about him that you think is really fascinating? And then the second question I would ask is, did he have an interest in esoteric stuff, in your opinion?
Okay, so um, generally, outside of Masonry, maybe the most interesting thing to me about Washington was always that he was a proud British soldier who had uh, dreams of rising to becoming a British general and being a leader in the world's most powerful empirical army. And because of the fact that he was a colonial, he did not get the promotions he thought he deserved in the British Army, uh, and that really informed and inspired a lot of his personality and ideology that later led to him being the father of uh, the movement that split the colonies off from Britain. Um, and so, just
Interesting.
generally, just the idea that if a few things had gone just a different way, George Washington would be maybe the greatest British general in history who wasn't born in England, or it's weird to think of it that way, but just a few tweaks to
Right.
the story, and that's what happens. Uh, Masonically, he had an event that was very similar to the one I mentioned about Joseph Brant. A British spy was caught, and I can't remember if he was a spy or if he was just a messenger who was intercepted, but one way or another, a British soldier was captured by Washington's men and was going to be executed. Washington, uh, upon the gentleman's personal belongings being examined, Masonic documents were within them. It was brought to Washington's attention, and he not only ordered the stay of the execution, but gave the man all his stuff back. If I remember right, gave him some extra clothes, furnished him with a little bit of supplies, and then uh, made sure that he got back to England safely.
Mm.
Uh, and Years and years later, the nearly executed prisoner uh, gave back a Masonic apron, or yeah, basically gave back There's a Masonic apron now. I can't remember which lodge owns it, and I think it's there in Virginia. That that soldier who had been spared by Washington uh, gave back to an American lodge as a sign of Washington's mercy, but commitment to the Masonic Brotherhood. That in the time of war he spared the guy because
Wow.
of his Masonic affiliation. So that particular story for me was the one that set me down the path to create a whole paper and
Oh, I
presentation in
see.
Washington.
Interesting. So,
Uh,
so what about his interest in esoterica? Do you think he was one of those Masons there you can go and have a smoke with him and talk about, hey, what do you think this meaning of the all-seeing eye really is about, Washington?
Washington, he's he's a more enigmatic figure than he's often credited with being. So Franklin, right? It's
Huh.
all out there. Uh,
Yes.
Franklin left no
Yes.
mystery. All of his weirdness, all of his
Yes.
strange
Yes.
behavior,
And
his
he was deep. He
shortcomings.
was a deep guy too. And
Absolutely,
funny. Yeah,
absolutely. I love Franklin,
I do too.
and his grandson actually was a charter member of the Grand Lodge of Texas here, and was a very important figure in the founding of Freemasonry in Texas. But
And
uh,
Franklin was active. I mean, he was active in every
oh yeah,
sense of the word, like in life. I mean, just a very active guy.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Uh, Washington was in a strange role as a man. He was as close to there being a God among men that America's ever had. Uh,
Wow.
he was the if you could wrap up Ronald Reagan, Elvis Presley, uh, and I don't know, pick some other kind of really important figure. You know, John Wayne actually would probably be the right one. Elvis Presley, John Wayne, and Ronald Reagan wrapped into one. That's George
Wow.
Washington in America in the 1780s. Because of that,
Wow.
I
Wait,
think,
wait, is that how he was viewed, do you think, by people then? Or
yeah.
is that how we've made him now looking back?
Oh no, no, no.
Okay, interesting.
During his
Wow.
own lifetime,
Wow. He was a real
absolutely.
rock star.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. When he traveled around the new states, the parties, man, that were hosted sometimes by the lodges or what have you. If you read the bills on some of those parties and the amount of alcohol that was consumed by 20, 30, 40 people, it's unfathomable today. I mean,
Wow.
just extraordinary amounts of alcohol, and he was a dance maniac. Uh,
Really?
oh man, Washington.
Oh man, what I'd pay for those videos, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
If they
Uh,
existed.
he would dance for 3, 4, 5 hours. There's countless examples of people who went to parties that George
Wow.
Washington was at, and the biggest thing that pops up in all of their accounts is he was a marathon dancer. He could go all night.
Wow.
Uh,
Wow.
and
And what did he like? What did he like to drink? Do you know?
uh,
That'd be interesting.
yeah, that's something I should know, and I definitely would have in my notes, but I can't tell you off the top of head. Off the
Yeah,
top
if
of my
you find out, send me a messenger
Yeah,
message.
I can
Yeah,
do
yeah.
that. I do have a recipe for a beer that he used to make. So
Oh,
yeah,
cool.
uh, he esoterically, what I think may have been the case with Washington was that personally he did have interests in esoterica, but I think he viewed himself as somebody who uh, couldn't be seen as someone who had an interest in esoterica. He was a royalist, which sounds weird to say about the father of America, but within the Masonic context at that time, you had two in the New World, so the United States and Spanish Mexico, Texas, all that. You had two real kinds of Freemasons. You had the ones who were emotionally and politically and ideologically attached to the idea that monarchies could be good, that if you had a good king or a good queen,
Right.
monarchy was fine.
Oh
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
and
someone that could channel the divine will, and always do the right thing. Sure.
Absolutely.
Give them all power, if
Yep.
that's possible.
Which,
Yeah,
especially in that context, also those people tended to be very uh, fond of whether Catholic or some kind of older institutional religion. You had these Catholic royalists. Well, Washington was very much in line with those guys more than he was in line with the other kind of Mason, which was your Ben Franklin, your uh, anti-monarchy,
I see.
anti-old uh,
Yeah.
authoritarian religion.
So Washington perhaps was more of a visionary,
Yeah, yeah, he
an
definitely was a
idealist.
visionary, and an idealist, but he was not, as a man, he was not revolutionary enough for a lot of Americans. Even
I
though he
see.
was a rock star,
Right.
uh, uh, his political enemies often uh, accused him of being too kingly,
I
uh,
see.
and um, and that may have been a bit of an unfair criticism, but ideologically, he leaned that direction. Uh,
Interesting.
the boats are really starting to show up, so I'm moving inside.
Oh, cool. Well, the lighting's back.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I stopped the video and restarted it, and it was working fine.
Oh, okay, great. I can see you again. Cool, man. Um, one thing I was thinking about just now is and I'm guessing they exist, but there must be minutes from some of these lodges that Washington was was part of. And I'm wondering if there's been any analysis, or if anybody's, I'm sure if it exists, they have looked at, lodge minutes from lodges where Washington was present. And what did he say? Were there any notes saying, Washington advised to do this, or Washington brought this up? I think that would be really interesting.
Uh, Off the top of my head, I can't think of a whole lot of examples I found of minutes talking about things he did or said in meetings, but what there is relatively a lot of are extant uh, letters and
Uh,
reviews of Washington being a guest at lodges. So it might not have
cool.
necessarily been a stated meeting, so to speak, but um they would hold balls in his honor or invite him to some kind of anniversary event of the city or things like that. And oftentimes in those, you can find uh, where he said really significant things about what Freemasonry was or wasn't in his mind.
Interesting.
And
Do you remember anything in particular in that regard that he said?
Well, he held Freemasonry in very, 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 very high regard. I would say.
Wow. Wow.
Uh, so I've been to lodges in 50 states and uh, a few different countries, and sadly, I say it sadly, but I think Washington held Freemasonry in a higher regard than today's average Mason. Uh, and I don't mean that as an indictment of the average Mason today so much as maybe Freemasonry's role in society just doesn't seem as important to many Masons today as it did
Right.
at that time. But
So it wasn't just a bowling club during Washington's time.
right, yeah, exactly. I mean,
Right.
we were involved with a series of revolutions before, during, and after Washington's lifetime, and or role in the American Revolution. And he saw that, and I think what you see in the documents about him going to lodge events and cities that were hosting events that lodges were largely a part of, which is an interesting part of it. A lot of his activity, Masonically, so to speak, there during his years as president was cities or large public events happening, and the lodge for the local area would act as the liaison between the community and Washington,
Mhm.
which it's something you could just glaze right over. And I think when I started studying Washington's Masonic career 8 or 9 years ago, it was something that I glazed over several times. Uh, but the idea, just put it into today's perspective. President of the United States happens to be a Mason. He's coming to give a speech in your city, campaign speech or just whatever, public appearance. And instead of the Chamber of Commerce, the mayor, et cetera, one of these types of entities being the one to coordinate his presence at your event, it's the Masonic Lodge of your community that does it. Uh,
Wow. Wow.
yeah,
That's a real deep thing right there.
right.
Interesting.
And then he also actively responded to them and interacted with them. Uh, I regarding the earlier question about his esoteric identity, I think the best sign that he did have interest in esoterica is his letters with Jewish people.
Hmm.
Uh, there were Jewish Americans who corresponded with Washington, who spoke very highly of him, and then he in turn spoke very highly of the Jewish tradition,
Hmm.
uh, which and
Now,
at that time, the Jewish people were a very mysterious type of thing to a lot of Christians,
hmm.
uh, and they were uh, not always, and even today, they're often not treated very well, or thought of in a positive light. Washington loved Jewish people. He loved the Jewish tradition, um,
Wow.
which uh, I think as postmodern men, I think we take for granted the idea that being open to and interactive with people of other religions is just, you know, so what?
Yeah.
That's not a big deal at all to us.
Right.
Late 1700s, that was a big deal.
Hmm.
And and to not only interact with people of other religions, but to do so intimately, to
Right.
write letters with them and recognize their tradition. Uh,
Right. Well, that
that was an
speaks to,
esoteric type of thing at that time.
no, absolutely. And I guess that speaks to the fact that he was open-minded,
Yeah, absolutely.
relative to his time period.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, had respect for people of different faiths, and even perhaps studied a little bit of what their faith was,
Hmm.
which was also not the norm.
Hmm.
Um, that's interesting. So getting on a different tangent now, maybe this will be the sort of last little thing we discuss, Nazis and Freemasonry.
Nazis and Freemasons.
Nazis
Yeah.
and Freemasonry. So I watched a documentary on that. There's one or two on YouTube, or probably more actually, um, on this topic. And from what I could glean, and I'd love to hear your take on this, from what I can glean is that Nazis were interested in Freemasonry for two reasons. One is they were interested in any secrets, occult secrets that were available throughout the world, and they were sending people all over the place trying to, get the documents, get everything they could get their hands on. Anybody that says they have secret knowledge, we want it. One, it seemed like that kind of came out as a theme. The other one was, who the hell are these Freemasons? We need to stomp them out because they could oppose us, because they're all for freedom of thought and things like that, and we're fascists, and they could be perceived as a threat to our power, and our control over the population. So that's kind of my two things that I took from my limited, sort of read of this confluence. But yeah, I'd love to hear what came out in your research, and what are your perspectives on the link between the Nazis and the Freemasons.
Sure. Um, I think both of those things are absolutely accurate. I think those are two major reasons Nazis had an interest in Freemasonry. I think one way you could trace the focus Nazis had on Freemasons would be by looking at why each Nazi leader had an interest or wanted to target Freemasons. So if you'll give me 1 second, I got to plug in my computer.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, yeah. Otherwise, you'll go black. You go dark.
Actually, I had it right here, so that was convenient. But Klaus von Barbie or Heinrich Himmler or Hitler himself. When you look into each individual's views on Masonry, you can find that each leader might have had a different reasoning. But a few things that really ought to be pointed out anytime Nazis and Freemasonry are discussed. Number one, the forget-me-not was never used as a secret Masonic symbol to identify Masons in Nazi-occupied territory. It's a very common myth told today. It's a common myth that I used to share because I accepted it. I'm embarrassed to say I heard the story, I loved the story, and I shared it. But the record is very clear that didn't happen.
Okay.
But another thing that I think should absolutely be pointed out anytime this is talked about, and it has to be done carefully, but if you look at the Nazi treatment of Freemasons in the first 5 or 6 years of the Nazi Party after it rose to prominence, you find something that I think is pretty interesting. One thing that Freemasonry being attacked by Nazis is often lumped into is the Jewish connection. And without a doubt, in Nazi propaganda, Freemasonry was labeled and portrayed as a Judeo Masonic conspiracy, right?
Right.
But how an entity, how an influencer portrays something in their propaganda does not necessarily correspond to how that influencer thinks about the thing they're producing propaganda about. And so what you find in the early years of Nazism is that Freemasons were a primary target directly of Nazism. A very elaborate and sophisticated filing system was developed to keep track of who was Masons, who was, what kind of Masons they were, and you think of like the Dewey Decimal System. The Nazi Party had a unique Dewey Decimal style system just for keeping track of Masons across Europe. It wasn't because of, as far as I can tell, it wasn't because of the Jewish connection. And in fact, in the early years, there seemed to have been a more serious focus on Freemasonry than Judaism. And the reason I say that it has to be carefully talked about is anytime people talk about Nazism, it can devolve rather quickly into, the Jews got treated poorly, but, and I'm not saying that at all. Without a doubt, the worst and most quantitative victims of Nazism were Jewish people. But a shift happened, I want to say it was 1941, 1942, when the Nazi Party moved off of a focus on Freemasonry and more directly onto Judaism. And that's something that I think needs to be explored more. I don't have answers exactly on why that was or what it meant. But I will say this. I think a major reason that the Nazi Party was so focused on Freemasonry was that Freemasonry had resources, libraries with rare books and artifacts, art collections with rare paintings and sculptures, and plain and simple, that meant money. And wars are expensive.
Wow.
One of the first things that the Nazi Party did as it invaded new territories across Europe was to outlaw Masonry and follow up the outlawing with a seizure of properties and bank accounts to liquidate them and fund whatever else they needed to be doing. Plain and simple, I think a big part of it was Freemasonry had money, or it had things that were worth money.
Yeah,
and,
I think that's interesting. That's a very practical approach to why they were interested. And like you said before, I mean, there were different people in the Nazi Party that might have had different interests or levels of interest in Masonry and different reasons behind their interest. So there's a diversity, I'm sure. And I think I remember reading somewhere, I don't know if Hitler said it or someone high up in the Nazi Party, that, you know, we're sort of making fun of the Freemasons with their childish symbols and stuff like that. Do you know
Hmm.
what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, they were calling us like kind of childish,
Yeah.
immature, occult society. Give me a
Yep.
break, you know, these idiotic children with their
Yeah.
symbol.
Yeah,
Yeah,
which was in line with the way the Nazi Party undermined a lot of old traditions in Germany. In order to get people behind them and backing them, they portrayed religions in general as being childish and
right.
uh, the
And
kind of
morality
symbolism.
and
Yeah,
listening to your conscience as a
yeah,
ridiculous thing and a weakness.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Uh, my favorite story of Nazism and Freemasonry is one that I learned about reading Red Triangle, a book about the history of anti-Masonic movements and ideologies. And it's very briefly mentioned in there. And since then, I've done a deep dive, and I'm in the middle of translating a book about the main figure in the story. But uh, when when Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, as I said, with elsewhere, they immediately outlawed Freemasonry, and the Grand Master of the Netherlands at the time was a what I call a career Mason. It's something that's almost unheard of these days, but back then Freemasonry was organized differently, even in America. Uh, Dues were much higher than they are today, relatively to the dollar's value, and Masonic lodges were run as corporations. They were run as businesses, where finances were an important part of how you ran the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, uh, leaders of Freemasonry were able to be full-time Masons because the lodges could afford to pay them to do full-time jobs for them. Uh,
Ooh, I want that again.
uh,
When you love to be paid to do Masonic research and be paid well.
yeah, I hear you. I can tell you so I'm the secretary of my lodge, and
Yeah.
uh, from 1916 to 1962, one guy was secretary for half a century. And he had a
Wow.
full-time salary with vacation leave and benefits, and that was the
Wow.
norm across American Masonry back then.
Oh,
And it's that kind of thing is unheard of now. But if you can imagine having an organization that runs well enough to do that, uh, a lot of the problems we're dealing with now wouldn't exist. But anyway,
yeah.
uh, the Grand Master of the Netherlands at the time, Hermanus von Tongeren, uh, was one such guy who had had a full career in the military, the Dutch military, retired, and then became a full-time Mason and rose to the level of Grand Master. The Nazis invaded, they outlawed Freemasonry, so Freemasonry had to go underground. The way they went underground, coffee. In the Netherlands, coffee clubs became the cloak that was thrown over Masonic meetings. They would show up at a coffee house and taught handle their Masonic business and what have you. And this went on for a few months. Klaus von Barbie, the butcher of lions, as he's famously remembered or infamously remembered, horrible man. Klaus von Barbie was the Nazi Party's leader in the Dutch invasion and the aftermath. He was charged with figuring out what to do with the Masonic lodges and Masonic resources of the Netherlands, and starts trying to track down the Masonic leaders. He identified
What was he looking for them in the coffee houses or what?
well, that's what happens. So
Ah.
von Tongeren manages for a few months to keep Freemasonry going and under the guise of coffee clubs. He shows up one day,
Mm.
and he and the guys are arrested. So
Wow. Wow.
the gig was up, right? He gets heavily interrogated and tortured, and then put in a train, shipped off to a work camp. His son found a note that he had scribbled onto a piece of paper and thrown from the train. I can't give you the exact quote off the top of my head, but something along the lines of, God help me now, I love you all, your old boy, Hermanus von Tongeren, or something. A really heartfelt note.
Wow. Wow.
But he died after a series of interrogations. And it would normally be a sad story, but I said this was my favorite story, so it can't end
Okay.
good. It doesn't.
Okay.
With his death, the control of Dutch Masonic accounts and assets was made open. It was open. The guy in charge of things is gone. The Nazi Party was more easily able to jump in and start seizing things. When they tried to do that, Klaus von Barbie was dismayed to find that everything was gone. They had all these records that they'd been keeping since the 30s of masonry across Europe, and this much money was supposed to be here. These rare books were supposed to be at that lodge. These paintings were supposed to be over, and everything was gone. Through the coffee clubs, Klaus von Barbie had pooled all of the Masonic resources of Netherlands, liquidated it, smuggled some of it out, and instilled his daughter, Jacoba von Tongeren, with leadership of the Masonic network in the Netherlands.
Oh, wow. Wow.
She used it to create what is now known as Group 2000. It is today considered the largest Nazi resistance movement led by a woman. And
fascinating. Wow.
Was not known to have existed until she was finally convinced to write her memoirs and share them. It was an amazingly elaborate and sophisticated system of espionage, funding of newspapers against Nazism, funding of the purchase of guns. So literally, the Dutch Masonic Grand Lodge directly funded the killing of Nazis. And
not a bad thing, you know, not a
right,
bad
yeah.
Masons are normally nonviolent.
You can literally say that Dutch Freemasonry was in the Nazi killing business, and
wow.
They did so in a tremendously efficient way. And for the last year now, I've been in contact with Hermanus von Tongeren's grandson on working to get a version of this story translated and shared, because it's woefully underknown and undertold. But there were cases.
Could be a movie. It could be a good movie too.
Oh, I think it'd be an amazing.
The story would be an amazing movie. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. An absolutely amazing film. I'd hope to see it made someday, but
maybe you're gonna make it, bro.
So that's my favorite story. I could give you a whole list of my least favorite stories, and that's an important thing to also say anytime you're talking about Nazis and Freemasonry, was that a line was drawn by the Nazi Party, and like with anything else, you had people who made the right choice, like Hermanus von Tongeren, and you had people who made the wrong choice. And so there were Nazi Freemasons, there were SS Freemasons, and what have you, which is hard to fathom, because as we know, a true Mason would not be capable of such views.
No.
But that did happen too. And it's easy for us to talk about, we now know something as many as up to 250,000 people who were killed by the Nazis were Freemasons. And that's the systematic killing, and not counting the people who were killed in war and stuff like that. But and a minimum of 40,000 were killed specifically for being Masons. So, and I say that's easy to talk about. I don't mean that's easy to talk about, but it is easier to talk about Freemasonry as being victims, defenders, or opponents of Nazi Germany, which is true. But it is also true and important to talk about the fact that some Masonic lodges in Germany were enablers of Nazism, and some Masonic leaders joined the Nazi movement. So it's a very sad and disappointing part of Masonic history, but it's real and also needs to
Right.
be
Yeah,
looked
well,
at.
you know, it's a, you know, speaks to the fact that Masons are human beings too. And, you know, although Masonry does promote, you know, being a virtuous and ethical person and helping to bring light into the world and positivity, it doesn't mean that message penetrates every single brother.
Right.
And it also gets the whole idea of the West Gate, you know, like how are we vetting every brother that comes in the lodge? Are we doing that well enough? Did they do it well enough in the time of the Nazis in Germany? For some of these brothers that decided, you know, Nazism, you know, didn't conflict with their Freemasonry, which doesn't
Yeah.
make any sense to those of us who understand it. Um, so yeah, there's always going to be bad apples in any organization, unfortunately. But brother, you know, this has been awesome. You got a wealth of historical knowledge that I really appreciate. I'm not I'm an appreciator of history, but I don't know as much about it as you. You've got that background, which is awesome. So it just makes questions rise naturally. I'd love to hear all the different answers you have. But hey, I want to hear about this before we shut off the Historical Light podcast. Tell some of
Oh,
the viewers about that, you know, because I think that's where they might be able to access some more.
sure. The Historical Light podcast was started by Alex Powers. He is the director of the Kansas Lodge of Research and past master of Gardner Lodge in Kansas. I'm the deputy director there of the Kansas Lodge of Research. I mentioned earlier in the show that I have family in Kansas. Uh, uh, I came onto the show, gosh, man, I don't know, 3 years ago as a guest. I've been on it a couple of times, and he asked me to come on as a co-host. So we are sharing in the direction of the project now. Historical Light is a project that has a podcast. The project is to not only share historical research that we've done and dug up, but also to encourage Masons to do their own, as well as help them reach the resources in order to do that. So we do training programs, and we don't charge for that stuff, I should point out.
But you do charge for the T-shirts. Hey,
Ah.
got to make money somehow, right? You know.
So the logo here, you've got the skull you mentioned earlier. There's a key. There is a keyhole here in the front of the skull with light bursting out of it. The idea being
cool.
that we are unlocking the dark, unfortunately underexplored volumes of Masonic history to share.
I like that.
With the world.
I like
there's
that.
a lot of stuff sitting on shelves in Masonic lodges that really needs to be examined, preserved, and shared. I have found a letter from J. Edgar Hoover, a letter from Cecil B. DeMille. I've held a Benjamin Franklin signed document that had previously been unknown, and dug up all kinds of stories, and mostly just because nobody takes the time to do it. And you know, if your lodge is even 100 years old, there's history in it that is worth telling, and nobody's going to tell it unless you get out there and do it. And that's what Historical Light's about.
Fascinating.
We're on historicallight.com, but also Spotify and YouTube and Facebook, and pretty much anywhere you want to look, you can find us.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, there's so many hidden gems, and I think that's what you're trying to bring out is some of those hidden gems historically. And I think I can relate even on this show, Just Masons. I mean, one of the ideas behind it is that, you know, every person, every Mason has something interesting about them, you know, and it's kind of like a deep dive into an individual and their background and their thoughts on different topics. And I just find that everyone in this world is interesting, and you know, we shouldn't take people for granted. And that's why it's also kind of a play on words, Just Masons. Like we're just guys, you know, regular guys, which is true on one level, but we're also guys that are trying to be just and righteous.
Yeah,
Yes. Just
I
Mason.
feel ashamed for not picking up on your double entendre. That's
Yes.
clever.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, actually, no, to be honest, I'm not that clever. I thought of that after the name came. So it was another level in my own mind that I'm like, wait a minute, Just Masons. Oh
yeah,
shit. So it's
yeah.
not like I intentionally made it because of that double entendre.
Maybe not consciously, but some
Right.
part of
Maybe.
your
Yeah.
psyche.
There you go.
Yeah, yeah,
The Sophia, the guiding Sophia brought it out somehow.
yeah. I love it.
Yeah. So yeah, brother Robert, thank you so much, bro. This has been fabulous. Fantastic show. A lot of good information. And let's stay in touch. And I'm sure you'll be coming on again. I mean, I've got a rotation of people. I mean, there's so many people I want to talk to.
Well, you're fun to talk to.
Well, thank you. You're fun to talk to too. So let's do it again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right, brother. Thank you so much. Have
Thank
a
you, man.
blessed day.
You too.
Cheers.